OpenAI. They just pulled off one of the most complex, I would say, corporate restructurings, going from nonprofit to, some would say, worth maybe close to $1 trillion for-profit machine. And there's a playbook here. And so just to set the stage, OpenAI originally started as a nonprofit in 2015. They wanted to have open source AI, hence OpenAI, ensure AI benefited humanity and have it be owned by a nonprofit. And now they just recently did a capped profit hybrid structure, and they're going to do a full conversion to a Delaware public benefit corporation here in the next year. So I know you track OpenAI closely, you track AI closely, and then we'll do the first chart up here of who owns OpenAI. So we got a chart here that shows who owns AI. This shows the current cap table of OpenAI. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts, Jim, on this and the restructuring that these guys are doing?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because Elon, his whole idea with this and why he called it OpenAI is to make it available to everybody. And I think his concern was that anyone who controls this can have too much power. So if you think about that, it's going against what Elon had hoped for, right? And I think we were talking about earlier, you said that he's calling it closed AI now because they're becoming a for-profit. It makes sense because if they're raising money doing things like that, no one wants to give money to a nonprofit. They want to give money to a for-profit business so that they can get a return on their capital. I mean, those are my thoughts off the top of my head. What do you think? You're much more into this space than I am.
Yeah, I think the other thing I think that was important for OpenAI here is they needed to figure out a way that they could have their existing employees and other shareholders monetize the investments. And so with this new structure, Microsoft's going to own maybe around a quarter, just over a quarter. And so although this is an interesting play for entrepreneurs who may want to get exposure to OpenAI, it's privately held, but Microsoft does have a large cut of the cap table there. And then there is still a nonprofit arm, and we'll talk through how you can go from a nonprofit to a for-profit. You can't essentially, there still has to be some benefit for the public good. You have to do a valuation, et cetera. But I think the big thing is just they're able to increase the amount of equity compensation they can give to their key employees, and they can continue to raise more and more capital. And with the whole data center build out, the AI build out, they just need a bunch of capital. And so I think they needed the flexibility on their cap table.
Yeah, it's interesting. And just as a side note, your comment about owning Microsoft to own OpenAI because they're such a big holder of that position, it's the same argument when you say, well, you know, I don't have any international in my portfolio. Well, maybe you own U.S. companies that have significant international exposure, so that can be a way to get international, although you do lose the currency play if the U.S. dollar gets weaker by having some international that can help you on that side of things. But same thing with Microsoft, owning Microsoft or even owning a big company that has a large ownership stake in a company that's private is a way to get exposure. So I know that's not exactly what we're talking about, but I thought that'd be worth mentioning.
Yeah, no, definitely interesting. And then mechanically, when you're going from a nonprofit to a for-profit, you have to do a fair market value assessment to value the underlying assets, or at least the private, or I should say the nonprofit part of the balance sheet there and the fair market value, because then that needs to still be a nonprofit. So they do a valuation, they determine essentially what is the value of this cut, because again, part of the ownership is still going to be owned by the nonprofit arm. And so then that's how they make sure that otherwise everyone would start as a nonprofit and then flip to a for-profit because it'd be a tax loophole. So as part of this, that's an important piece of this. And the valuation, I'm sure, will be scrutinized by the IRS because that's going to be a big determinant. And essentially the fair market value that they come up with and they derive, that is what essentially has to go to their nonprofit arm over time in terms of equity, cash payments, et cetera. So that's, I think, an important thing of if you're an entrepreneur and saying like, well, why don't I just start a nonprofit and flip to for-profit? You can, but all of the equity or the enterprise value build up until that trigger date needs to essentially still be locked in for the charity, and then any growth essentially above that you could tuck in underneath a for-profit arm.
Yeah, makes sense. And as you said, I've known entrepreneurs that want to start their own nonprofit, and there are certain advantages to that, but it's really because they want to make a difference in a specific part of the world or in a specific group of people they're trying to help, and so they do a nonprofit. But yeah, going from nonprofit to profit, this is the biggest I've ever seen in that space, and it's usually fraught with a lot of challenges.
Yep. All right. Well, we got the next chart here, and this has heavily been talked about not only in the tech space, but also in the finance space, is the capital flows among not just AI, but all of the different players and really that are building out the AI. And we got a chart here that shows OpenAI, Microsoft, Nvidia, CoreWeave, AMD, and Oracle. And really just what this does is just shows all the money in terms of chip purchases, infrastructure, equity investments, and revenue sharing between all of these different businesses. And the fear is are all of these companies just so intertwined that they're like making themselves too big to fail as an ecosystem? And Nvidia really is the big dog in the game here with the hardware and the chip the chip manufacturer. And so there's huge contracts with OpenAI and CoreWeave wanting to buy as many of these Nvidia chips as possible, but they may not have the capital. So they may be just, doing certain type of equity swaps and different types of different relationships here. And so when you look at something like this, Jim, right, these are all publicly traded companies except for OpenAI that you're looking at here. Right? Does this make you concerned how interrelated these all are now?
It does. I think the mitigating factor is where AI is going. And this is not something that's going to plateau. But this whole circular movement of money is concerning because if you had a problem, then it hits across all these different areas with all these huge companies. And the other thing is, if you think about things like profits and PE ratios and those kinds of things, you go, is it real if you're paying me and I'm paying you, and that way we're driving up our revenue and our earnings? Does that really mean that there are real earnings here if we're just paying each other? And I think the answer is yes. And I also believe that we're still in its early stages. It's going to be so big and powerful. But, this kind of comes back to some of the questions in the stock market, because the stock market is valued where it is because it's betting on AI in the future. And the question is, will that AI bet come through as the market is reflecting today in prices? I don't know. Anyone's guess, I guess, for sure. I would say AI is in the early stages, and we're going to see it having a huge impact everywhere, not just with these companies.
Yeah, we're seeing a big impact in our business already, which has been awesome to see. And hopefully every entrepreneur is forcing their team to incorporate AI into their workflows.